I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another episode of Postcards from a Dying World. My guest today, Laird Barron, was guest on episode number 8, and we are now on episode, I think this will be 164. So, but you've been back in between. You came back to do the panel on top 10 horror short stories. So Laird's been here, but Laird, actually, you were, I think, the first dedicated interview I did for the podcast for the first Isaiah Coleridge novels. So we'll get into what's happened in a little bit, but welcome back to Postcards from a Dying World. It's wonderful to have you.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
We are going to be talking about Laird's new short story collection, Not a Speck of Light. I do not think we are going to get heavy into spoilers, but as we do around here, we're going to talk a lot about process. So at a certain point when we start talking about these, if you want to go in absolutely totally cold, we'll tell you when we're going to start specifically talking about this book. But as some of you may or may have not known, because if you're new to Laird's work, Laird writes a couple of different genres, but is known for writing cosmic horror short fiction. He's one of the best we got, and also has written a trilogy of crime noir novels with around the character Isaiah Coleridge, which I highly recommend. And the first interview we did, we talked about the first book in that trilogy. So if you go back and listen to that episode, you'll get more details on that one. But what Laird, I mean, we got to talk about the elephant in the room. We had because one of the things that happened over the last couple of years is that we weren't sure we were going to get this collection. And one of the things that was really heartening for me is that when you got sick in, what was it, 2022? Was it that yeah.
Right.
Yeah, what I was really heartened by was the sheer amount of concern, passion there was for knowing that you were all right, following your story. You want to tell people a little bit about what happened on your end? Because I think I was really impressed by how much the horror community just really got behind you.
Yeah, I turns out I was probably sick for a couple years, but I just sort of shrugged it off. I tried to bulldoze my way through it, but toward the end of 2022, I fell seriously ill, and it was a long time before I finally got dragged off to the hospital, and by then it was almost too late. And one thing I remember though is I'm lying in the ICU, and I was essentially paralyzed. I could barely move. I was in and out of reality, and they didn't even really have me on any heavy drugs or anything. I was just that sick. Uh, I was living the life of one of my characters, one of my
Right.
stories, and but I remember John Langan and my partner Jessica M. They would read this outpouring of support that I was receiving. I was really confused, the first time either of them said anything about it to me. They just said, "Hey, there's lots of letters," and I didn't I didn't put it together that it had become a public because I
Yeah.
was so sick. I just went to the hospital, and for about 5 weeks I was out incommunicado. I wasn't online or anything. So that first few days, yeah, I had a hard time understanding and I couldn't even
Right.
process it. But yeah, every day John and Jessica would come in and they would be reading all these notes that people had sent me, and it meant a lot. It was very uplifting while I was struggling because I was in a life or death struggle, and it did cheer me up a lot.
Well, and I had the experience of talking to another local writer here in San Diego. We were talking around that time, Anthony Trevino and I, and we realized that we both, during those first couple days, would find ourselves going to John Langan's social media specifically to see if there were updates. And basically Anthony and I were like, "Oh, you did that too," right? And part of it is, you know, and I had this whole discussion with a coworker one day because I said there was some update that you were doing well, or some you had taken some, you were doing better. And I had this real sense of relief on my face. My coworker asked me, what was going on, and I said, "Oh, this writer that I'm a big fan of," and then she said to me, she was like, "Oh, you look really relieved," and I was like, "I am." And then she's like, "How close are you?" And I was like, "Well, we've talked on the podcast. That's it." And we had this whole discussion about what it means for writers and readers to be connected to the authors that, and I said, it's not just the books that I want more Laird Barron books. It's that you get to know the personality of these writers, and you care about the voice that you're following. You know what I'm saying? And so it was something that it really meant a lot to me to see the outpouring on your behalf, even you're not being you. So I'm sure it felt really powerful in the moment, right?
It feels more powerful now, really. It took me a long time. I'm still recovering. I'm nowhere near where I was hoping I would be a year and a
Right.
half later, but I'm not dying at least. And it was within hours, and they cut me open and they took a lot of my innards out, and permanent damage. I have a lot of problems, but it 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 was almost like having a eulogy, and then you get to see it because um I don't think anybody realized, but it was closer than I realized until after it was all over. And um I so many people wrote kind notes, but there were a lot of people, professionals, and I would say the vast majority were people I've never spoken with. I mean, there were hundreds of people that I know, but there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of other people who left notes that I didn't, we've never talked. And a lot of those people had had their own experiences, or a loved one had. They talked about reading my work, going back to the early aughts, so the last 20 years, and that they've gotten them through something. And that was powerful. It remained, and it took me over a year to even kind of come to grips with that. And now when I sit down to write, I feel, you never know how you're being received by people. And I got a glimpse that, my work meant a lot more. Maybe I meant a lot more to people than I realized. And that's very humbling.
Yeah. Yeah, it was powerful to see, just as a fan of your work. And it was neat. Now, this might sound a little ridiculous, but this is why we're here to talk about this book. But I remember at some point in the process where you had kind of tweeted out something or said something about, like, I'm just starting to get back to writing. And
Right.
again, that friend of mine, Anthony, and I had this conversation, and I said, "Oh man, I cannot wait to see, um, how Laird comes back from this, because I, as a person who writes cosmic horror, like having this kind of, life, challenging event, it gives you a lot of time to think and to sit there and think about these things. So I don't want to make light of it, but it's one of the things that made me excited about this collection in many ways. It's one of the reasons why I was like, I can't wait. for, I requested it at the library, but I was like, I cannot wait, and I was like, I have to have this now. So, um, let's can we talk about the experience of getting back to writing? Like,
Sure.
like, what was that process like?
Pretty awful. Um, so a couple of things. First of all, thank you. But secondly, a lot of the stuff in there was stuff that I have
From
been
before?
writing over the last decade.
Yeah,
Some of it, though, was written while I was deathly ill and didn't realize just how ill I was. And then, of course, the original story in there, Not a Speck of Light, I wrote last year. Um, as I was recovering, that was one of the first things I wrote to
yeah,
get the original story in. But so in the future, it will have. I think you will see a very interesting change in my writing as more and more of the stories come out that I've written since then. But um, yeah, the first. So I went into the hospital in early January and I got out in the middle of February. But I was literally could have remained in the hospital as far as my health was and my physical condition for another month or two. Essentially, it wasn't until May of last year that I could even think about doing anything. And I
sure.
started, I mean, hobble. I could hobble around. I couldn't go up or downstairs very easily, anything like that. And but I did. I immediately started writing. I must be a writer because
Yeah.
even the week after the hospital, I was still trying to write. And what what made it so difficult, and it still is difficult, my vision, it my vision was reduced, damaged during the course of events. The first 3 months, I have this really nice, you can't really see it, but I have this really nice office chair I invested in a few years ago. It's like a $500 chair because I'm in it all the time. And I couldn't sit up in it for more than about 7 to 10 minutes at a time for the first 3 or 4 months. We get used to sitting here. If you want to sit here for an hour, you do it, then maybe get up and stretch. No, no, just a few minutes. Like it was like I would start slumping forward. I had no muscle tone in my core. I was so sick for months afterward, after I got home, that I just sitting here, then I couldn't see very well. My hands were numb. I couldn't feel the keyboard reliably, the keys. So that slowly but surely over time has abated. I still like I can sit for long stretches. My vision is still pretty, it goes in and out. It's really messed up. And so I'm just, but I have more reserve, a little bit more reserve now than I did a few months ago. So like every few weeks, I feel like I'm making a little bit of progress. But yeah, so writing went from a strictly intellectual, like you intellectually tax yourself to, oh no, it was physical as well. Like I would write for 15 minutes and then have to go lie down and then come back and do some stuff and then write for another 15 minutes. That's how it was. And luckily the last few months I can now write, and I can write for half an hour, 40 minutes, and that's much closer to what I'd like to be able to do.
Well, and I think even for people that are totally healthy, if you're a very serious writer, sometimes like a serious writing session will tire you out in a way that's hard to explain to people who don't write,
Well,
like,
just to interject, that's really interesting you say that because I've always been, up until the last few years, I've always been a physical person. My
yeah,
jobs, before I became a full-time writer, I spent almost 40 years well, 30 something years of just, manual labor, those kinds of jobs. And then, of course, I used to have sled dogs. I used to live in the woods. I mean, I'm no stranger to being, active. But Jessica, my SO, she has commented long before I ever got sick. She goes, "You're in there." She goes, "I can always tell you've written a grueling scene because I'd walk out, my hair will be sticking up. I'll have sweat, like my hair will be matted." And she
right,
goes, "You're sweating." And I said, "Yeah, I'm because I was writing a Coleridge scene. He's in the clutches of evil again, or something like that." And
right.
yeah, for me, writing has always been physical. I always feel like I'm almost like I'm in the scene doing battle. And she knows not to come up on me when I'm writing because my react, I'll fly out of the chair. You know, she'll always cover a distance. She'll go, "Hey, Laird, time for dinner," or, you know, or, "Hey, the
Yeah.
show's on," or whatever it is. So, but you add, so that was always taxing. And then to add physical, you know, I'm debilitated. It's been tough, but you know what? I'm at a very slow rate, but I'm work my way through it. I'm still getting it done.
Right. Yeah, and that drive, I mean, we saw King go through that after the van accident, right? And very publicly.
I thought about him. He talked
Yeah,
about this, and you know, he right. This is something that you know, if you're driven to write, you're or whatever it is you do, you'll find a way to do it, no matter how much it hurts.
right. Well, or Clive Barker after his dentist situation, and
Yeah.
yeah, and it's funny because you know people who don't do it, they think you're just sitting there typing, or they write emails and they're like, why is that, why would that be tiring, but if you're writing something that's very emotionally taxing or whatever, I just had uh Sarah Langan on the podcast, and she was talking about how her husband always tells her that she walks into the kitchen and gets food and she doesn't remember, when she's writing, right?
Oh yeah.
And that, writers have those kinds of experiences. It's just you kind of enter another state and it can be exhausting. So
Well, first of all, JT, that's her husband, and Sarah, they're both great writers. I really respect both of them and consider them friends as well. But you know, I'm a I don't like I don't like the mystique of the artist. I always
right,
that kind of annoys me. But people who are driven, artists who are driven to be artists, there's nothing mystical about it. So let me preface it that way. But
mm,
there is no question, having lived a spectrum of lifestyles and jobs, you know, obviously I will take dry, climate controlled, you know, you can be healthier typing, but it's no less of a job than being a plumber or working landscaping or anything else. And it can be grueling in its own way if you're committed to it. It's not, because I used to put 1,000 words a day in when long before I was ever published. I easily put 1,000, and I would do it by hand. I didn't type. And that was so much easier than once the stakes were raised and I have deadlines and a fan base and editors
yeah,
who expect a certain level of quality. The the mechanical act of writing isn't necessarily difficult depending on who you are, but the act of writing for publication can be. And writing with intentionality can be. And that's
sure,
how it is for me.
yeah. So uh if people want to be totally cold on this collection, uh pretty soon we're gonna tap them out, because we're gonna start getting into the stories. But before we do, without like giving away what any of the stories are, or what, can we talk about the four different sections that, or is it five? It's four,
4. Mhm.
sections of the short story collection and what they mean. I have guesses, but what the titles mean. But the stories are broken up into four sections, and you said that a lot of these stories were ones that you've written over the last decade. Some have been collected before, and some are familiar if you read enough anthologies. I read a couple of them before this time, but what was the over before we get into the four sections? What was the overarching theme that you wanted to pull this particular collection together with?
You know, this one, uh, I consider it of a piece with the last collection, Swift to Chase, which was about 8 years ago. And so that was my Alaska collection, and you'll notice this one has multiple stories about Alaska too. I don't consider it a continuation of the Alaska stories though, but I do consider it a continuation of kind of my exploration of more traditional tropes and themes and whatnot. Like my first three collections, the ones that, when I kind of broke onto the scene, those were Lovecraftian cosmic horror. And, you know, that's become, I won't say old hat, but a lot more people are familiar with that kind of horror these days, whether they're casual fans or obviously hardcore fans. But at the time, really the only people that were paying attention to Lovecraft or cosmic horror in general was a pretty small subset of fandom, and it's kind of exploded since then. I think it's easy to look at like, oh well, it's always been popular. I'm like, no, not 20 years ago it wasn't. There were a few people, but it was still pretty a pretty niche genre. And I did that, for a decade, and I watched it grow. ST Joshi's popularity exploded, and of course he's a big, a fanatic about it. Ellen Datlow released multiple anthologies. Plushies came out, movies. Uh, Hellboy really embraces it, so it became a lot more mainstreamed. And in the middle, tens, I started shifting into crime and more traditional tropes, but done my way. So like Swift to Chase was all about, the different archetypes, the slasher, there's the vampire, there's werewolves or shape changers, there's serial killers. This one has a bit of that. It's what I always like to do is I like to take something I've done before and remix it in the next collection. But I would say this one is much more taking those tropes and embracing the weird even more. So it's definitely horror, but the cosmic element is sort of I would say takes a back seat. It's like a background radiation. This is much more an exploration of the weird, and there are probably more science fictional elements in it than I've
Well,
done in the
yeah,
past.
and my favorite story in this one is 200% science fiction, but um one of two of my favorite stories, I should say, because I've kind of coming down the line, like not sure which one's my favorite. I almost always have a favorite when I read a collection, but um yeah, so let's talk about the different sections. So the first one is Blood Red. Well, let's go through all the names first. Blood Red Samaritans, The Wandering Stars, Alan Smithy is Dead, and Lake Terror. Now, the one that seemed the most obvious to me, obviously, is the third one, the Alan Smithy is Dead, because what I think you're trying to do. So, for those who don't know, Alan Smithy is the pseudonym of that directors can use if they want to not put their name on a movie. And so that was the one where I felt like you were trying to say that these stories were um, kind of in a more like pulpy vein or a more kind of B movie type vein.
Yeah,
Yeah. And,
that's pretty close. Yeah.
yeah. And that's the only one where I like immediately I was like, okay, I see what's going on there. So talk to talk to us about like what these titles mean. So Blood Red Samaritans, these are these seem like character stories to me, are very, very tied to the point of view. Am I wrong about that? Because that's where I took that one.
Right. Each of the titles, I have a thing about titles, and I really love the opportunity to title sections in books, whether it's a collection and it has subsections or whether it's a novel. I won't always do it. I haven't always done it, but I really do enjoy it when it fits my purpose. Um, I, I was talking about this the other day. I believe we were I went to a reading actually, and we were talking about the power of, how my philosophy about titling, and that sometimes it's just the obvious. There's some element in the story that you, when you read the story, the title totally makes sense. Like, that's a phrase from the story, or that's the villain, whatever. But other times it could be the key to an inscrutable story. If a story, you read it and you need to read it again, or maybe it doesn't fit until you read another story in the collection. That, or Aikman used to do that. Aikman used to write stories that would make more sense once you read more of his stories. You go, it kind of unlock. It's like decode. It sort of decodes that original story. And sometimes the title can provide a key. Like you're thinking about it in music. There'll be an instrumental. Why is Black Dog called Black Dog? Well, a black dog wandered through the studio while Zeppelin was recording. That's a case of, the dog's not even, the title has nothing to do with the music. It was just their mood while they were doing it. But in
Right.
some cases, the title will be, if you think about it from the point of view of the title, this inscrutable stuff maybe comes into focus, crystallizes. But other times the title can create something that seems straightforward and add another layer to it.
I also
And
love titles that have double meaning. Is like,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. And but there's another thing that art can do, and whether it's abstract art or whether it's an abstract title, and that is you're poking the whole time that I'm writing, I'm poking your brain. That's what I'm, you know, you have to participate. You have to read it. You have to think about it. But I'm doing my part. My part is just to stick the needles in. And a lot of times the title for me will do that. And I vary I vary their intent. I don't want it, I don't want it to always be, oh, it's something clever. Maybe that's
yeah,
what it is. In the case of this collection, the sections were there's no real heavy thinking or lifting to do. Each one of them just sort of refers to something, a maybe a phrase that was in one of the stories, like Samaritan. The very first story, she talks about being the good Samaritan, uh, and there's a lot of blood in those
right.
stories, and so there you go. Alan Smithy is dead. It's kind of an arch, There's a little bit of a tongue in cheek going on there because I obviously think highly of the stories, but there's a line in one of the stories talking about Alan Smithy, and I just thought it was redolent of pulp. It was redolent of B movies. The B movies are mentioned there, so that's what that was. Wandering Stars. I have to look at what stories do I have in that section. I have
Joran Val's Blood in My Mouth, Nemesis, and Soul of Me. So these are
right
the
the
more spaced
well
out stories.
a wandering star. Also, I wanted to put Nemesis. There's a reference in Nemesis to the rogue star that allegedly has wiped out the dinosaur. I mean, there's conspiracy theories about that. There's a secret star that rolls, or a planet that rolls around.
Right.
Could even be a secret, a hidden star, like a binary system. So that's all that was. Plus, there's there are wanderers, but and then the last one, Lake Terror. That one was meant to conjure. First of all, there is a Lake Terror in one of the stories unofficially, but I just loved it because what do when you hear Camp Crystal Lake or you hear Crystal Lake, you immediately are you see a campfire in the woods and you see people sitting around it and there's something in the woods stalking them. I felt like Lake Terror, is I start thinking summer camps and I start thinking Boy Scouts and I start thinking you're in the woods, but not necessarily the wilderness.
And
Obviously it's a place that people go to and it sets a mood in the mind.
yeah, and you got readers like me who are your target audience who you're playing like a fiddle because after each story, I'm going back and looking at the title of the section and being like, "Ooh, how does this fit?" And so,
Yeah,
you know, yeah, you got me thinking of it. I love when you title a story something and I have one title for one of my short stories that it was 4 years after it was first published that one person's like wrote me and said, figured out what the title was doing. And I was like, man, that's a cool feeling when somebody catches on to something like that, or like you got that hook where I didn't care if anybody else got the title over that time, but it's cool when one person does, right? So
right. That's exactly right.
yeah. And so I'm sure some of these are and since you care so much about titling, I'm sure some of these titles are ones that you know fit that for you. Like you don't care if we get it or not, but you've got what you're doing for it, right?
That's pretty much my entire writing thesis. Um,
Right. I don't
uh,
care if you get it or not, sir. And I'll tell you, and Laird, you should know, and this is one of the things that um like I have a coworker who's a big horror reader, and she asked me for recommend. She's always asking me what I'm reading, right? And when I was reading Not a Speck of Light, she was asking me questions about, should I buy this book? Should I read this author? And one of the things I said to her was, are you okay that you might not get every story? And then she was like, yeah, I think so. And I was like, because if you're okay with that, I was like, because some stories, and that's the thing, I feel like I connected to all these stories. This collection, there wasn't anything where I was like, I didn't get it. But when I read, I'm gonna look on the shelf, the Imago sequence, like, okay, I remember when I first read your work, that was the first book of yours I got as a full book, right? And I don't remember what stories, but there were definitely stories in there where, like, I don't know what the hell he's doing, but I really like the atmosphere and the vibe. So I'm okay with that. And then maybe I'll read it again someday, and maybe that time I'll connect with it. And so I explained your work that way to her, saying, like, if you're okay with that, this is an author that you will really dig. And I feel that same way about, for example, Brian Evanson, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't always know what Brian's doing completely, but I love every moment of reading where his words go. So I'm okay with that, right? And
That's reflective of how I enjoy a lot of the authors I enjoy. I like straightforward. I mean, Robert Parker, one of my favorite authors, doesn't get much more straightforward than a Spencer story.
right,
But I also love Brian Evanson,
yeah.
and I love it. I love it when he's being weird, and I love Robert Aikman and Takashi Miike, the filmmaker, and you know, the elliptical stuff. I have great love for it.
Well, and one of my favorite novels of all time is the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge by PKD, and I can tell you the first time I read it, I had no clue what was happening. Right now, I've read it 3 times. Now I feel like an idiot. I didn't get it the first time, but I was
But
okay with that feeling. Right?
well, I grew up reading. I'm nowhere the fan you are, scholar at this point, but I did grow up in the '80s reading a lot of PKD, and I'm sure that I don't claim him as an influence directly because I don't, or consciously, I should say, but I don't think there's any doubt that he's influenced me. I mean, I read
Right.
too much of his stuff for him not to have rubbed off, and he never, had a problem with just making you catch up with him.
Right. Well, and we were just Matt Bartlett and I were just discussing this online about
There's another great writer, by the way.
yes, and he's just now discovering PKD this year, and so we talk a lot because and he just read Man in the High Castle, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm totally lost," and I'm like, "Yeah, it's okay, you'll get there,
Right,
you'll
right.
figure it out."
I learned a lot from reading those guys. A lot of writers, they didn't have his style, but I mean,
Yeah.
PKD and Roger Zelazny, for example, two of the greats from that era, they had no problem with just starting in media res and here you go, and not explaining every little thing. Like, do androids dream of electric sheep? There's a lot of world building in there that he just expects you'll either get it or you won't. He doesn't have the contemporary tendency to, okay, I'm going to info dump everything. That's a skinny little book. And it starts off with you dial in a mood and you take some pills that give you some other stabilizing thing. And he doesn't explain to you there are no animals per se. You figure that out as you go. The whole
Well,
thing about the little trash vortexes that can swallow you up, he doesn't go into anything about that, like, not explicitly. You
not to
just,
not to diverge too much on this, but his trick was one of his reasons that people always say, well, he always has working class characters. But one of his tricks was if you have somebody that's down on their luck, they immediately explain the whole world to you by everything they owe, by everything they need. And
that's right.
that was his trick. And the formula was to always open on a character for example, like Galactic Pot Healer, the guy couldn't afford to pay for his dreams, with the dream circuit, and so that was one of his tricks. And but you're right, that's exactly right. They didn't have a problem dropping you in. And doing
Right.
it in short stories is very different from doing it in a novel too. And so one of the things about your work and one of the things that I love in these stories is that if people don't have a lot to hold on to on those things, the prose is so great that I get very involved in like the style of it enough that it carries me on, even if it's a story that maybe I don't know exactly what you're trying to say in the beginning, right? I'm enjoying the description of Alaska or the description of these characters. And one thing that I think you did a couple times in this collection, which is something that I think you've been doing more of in your writing in the last decade or so, is that you don't mind the person making references that your readers are that are pretty nerdy or deep cut. I think it was there's a character who makes a reference to Argento or something like
Probably. Yeah.
yeah. And I thought to myself, well, of course his readers are gonna get that. And if they don't, like it's okay because, it's okay. It makes sense for this character. This character would have that thought. This character would watch an Argento movie and make that comparison. And it's funny because I caught on to that and noticed that because it kind of influenced me thinking, hey, well, that's okay. That is an okay metaphor. I bet some editors would shy away from those things. And I liked that that was there. I don't know if that's a conscious thing or if that's an
It,
unconscious thing.
um, a little of both. I'm highly aware of what the criticisms are. I've been criticized for, you're a writer, you understand. You're
Yeah.
criticized for even daring to write something. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter what genre. Um, and so what I've made my peace. I'm a middle-aged dude now, and you know, uh, I am doing what I'm going to be doing, barring winning the lottery. And so I might as well. That was one of the. I'll tell you what. If anything changed about me during my sickness, was my fucks are depleted completely now. They were pretty sparse. The field was pretty fallow to begin with.
Right.
They're gone utterly now. Obviously, if next time I try to write a big five type novel, which I am working on something, I may have to pretend to have a couple. But the bottom line is I don't work with people. I love editorial guidance, but not when it comes to style, not when it comes to like the stories I want to tell. If I'm being ineffective at what I'm trying to do, then that's you tell me. But I'm really lucky. I work with some of the very best editors. I mean, Ellen Datlow, I've worked with her probably the most. There's no question she's one of the great editors. And part of her greatness is she knows when to let you run and she, give you free reign, and she knows when to say no. I understand that you're trying to accomplish this over here, but you're not doing it effectively, or this would be more effective if you brought something other element in. But she never tries to limit whatever, I'm only can speak for myself, but I'm sure that it's probably most writers would agree that work with her.
Well,
And
I'm sure she's got a lot of trust in what you're doing because of the
the
success that you've had.
the best editors are not heavy-handed. The editor I worked with, Sarah Minnick at Putnam, I I miss her terribly. I learned so much doing 3 books with her about how to write more accessible, more commercial fiction. So I have that in my arsenal now. The Coleridge stories are much more top 40 music than my short fiction. And I owe a lot of that to her. She points out what would work in a short story isn't going to work in a long, a commercial novel because of X, Y, and Z. If you're trying to reach a larger audience, and she was really really good at giving me concrete explanations, reasons, examples, things like that. So I'm still going to school, but the bottom line is I write what I want to write, and as long as I have a few people that want to come along with me for the ride, and I have the loyalty of a few editors, that are on the same frequency that I am, then I'm pretty pretty much set.
Now, I'm not going to go through every story, but there are a couple ones that I do want to highlight, and I'm starting with the first one, so I want to make that clear. But this is a good time for people if you don't want to know anything, if you want to go totally cold, to pause this and come back. But before we do, is there anything that you want the listeners to know before we get into talking about the stories?
Nope, just that I appreciate them.
Right. So the first story is in a cavern in a canyon. And can you give me a thumbnail on this one and where this came from and why you chose it to open the collection? Because opening a collection is a big deal.
Right. Uh, just the quick synopsis: a girl's father goes missing in the 70s, and she thinks that there may be a supernatural being responsible for that, and she spends the rest of her life looking for not so much for her father, but for evidence that this creature exists. And where it came from was pretty funny. I was walking with John Langan. We were walking the dogs. This was 10 years ago now. And it was here in Rifton, his place in Rifton, New York. And it was a kind of a wooded neighborhood with one street light. And the dogs started acting funny and pointing toward the bushes. And I looked down there, and it looked for the world like a person was lying there crawling. It was like they weren't moving, but they were like stretched out like they were crawling toward the road. And I could see the eyes and the mouth, and it was like very ghastly, pale. And the dogs, like I said, were kind of growling in that direction. And I realized it was a stump, and a tree had fallen over, and it was just the holes in the stump and the limbs stretching out. It looked just for a second in the tricky light like a person. And I remember John and I were like, I can't remember which one of us said, help or something like that. And I turned around and walked back in the house and started writing that story.
Well, and for me, one of the most powerful moments of the story is when she asks this creature, like, did you take my dad or did he skip out on me? This is something I've been wondering about. And I think the question itself, like, is a really powerful moment in the story. It's one that I thumbnailed the page like immediately as I was reading it, like because I knew I was going to ask you about it.
Well, I thank you. I opened and closed with a pair of pretty accessible stories. And that was the thing. I think overall the collection's pretty accessible. There's a couple stories that are out there, but I felt that in a cavern, in a canyon, and tiptoe were two of the stories in there that would speak to the broadest audience, um, with relatable. In the case of in a cavern, in a canyon, I feel as if Hortense is pretty relatable, and of course in tiptoe, which we may or may not get to, you're telling it from it's a frame story with a kid, an adolescent coming of age kind of story, and I thought those were fathers and sons. In this case, daughters and fathers. I thought those were pretty intensely relatable for the majority of people that might pick up the book.
Right. Now, was mobility written before or after you got sick? Because
That's a weird one, right?
yeah.
I was talking about this the other day that I've written probably three stories now that might as well have been prophetic. I wrote Old Virginia years and years ago, back in 2001, and for out of the blue, I just decided that the main character was deaf in one ear, and a few weeks later, I went deaf in my ear. And in the case of mobility, yeah, that whole thing is partially based on Brian Evanson, actually, a story he was telling us. And so I decided to have fun with him. But some of the
Oh, like calling
details,
it mobility.
yeah, right, because he has the novel Immobility, which I
Which,
love. I
oh,
everybody
I
run
love
out,
that novel too. It's one of my favorites of the.
absolutely run out and
Yeah.
get it. But I decided to take the piss out of Brian because Brian wrote a story years ago, and I always get the name wrong. But the main character loses his eye running through the woods, and it's very Laird Barronish. He denies that it was me, and so I'll take him at his word for that. But it was very at the time I thought I wasn't offended by any means, but I just thought, wow, he's writing a story. I'm thinly disguised Laird. So, and at the very end, to Michael Sisko. So I just did that. I just did that to him. It's a complete in joke. But
Oh, okay.
the all those parts are. However, like how he gets sick and stuff all comes from a story that Brian told us. However, the actual I don't want to spoil the story too much, but as he deteriorates throughout the story, that was completely spontaneous. That was nothing from anyone. I just thought this was compelling to me. And then a few years later I'm in a kind of a form of that situation. The irony wasn't lost on me.
This is kind of like Robert Bloch and Lovecraft killing each other in Weird Tales, right? So,
One of my
uh,
friends said you need to start writing stories about how you get rich.
yeah,
And have a breakout book.
yeah, right, right. About the breakout book, right? It's funny. Recently, I was reading because I'm working on trying to get that plaque put in the building where CL Moore worked in the 30s. I don't know if you've seen the thing I've been
I
doing
did.
about
I
that.
signed the letter.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good for
So
you. I think it's a
yeah,
really
and
worthy goal of you have.
yeah. Well, in her letters with Lovecraft, which I recently read, she talks about the block Lovecraft killing each other thing in one of the letters, and it's so funny because she's basically talking about a diss track battle, and from her perspective, it's so cool to see. I love that about mobility. That's neat. The glorification of Custer Poe seems obviously that's one of the Alaska stories. Was this collected before? Because this one felt familiar to me. I didn't know. I couldn't remember
Nope.
for sure.
It was anthologized initially. I wrote it for Steve Berman, and I want to say he was editing for Prime Books for that anthology. It was the Shades of Blue and Gray, like it was Civil War ghost stories. And
Yeah.
so that's why it's post Civil War, but it obviously deals with the Civil War quite a bit. And that's one of the only stories I've ever written. I say only one of because I wrote a story about a dog recently, and it's from the point of view of a dog who thinks a lot more like a dog than Rex. But that's one of the only stories that I've ever written like in dialect or at least partially in dialect. I don't normally do that, but I felt kind of compelled to do that one. That one's there's a little in joke in that one too. Um, that's a Jeff Vandermeer special.
Well, I'm sure he'll get it.
He
Uh,
did. I sent it to him. He chuckled.
yeah. That's cool. So in the blood in my mouth, there's a section where uh, you're describing Alaska in it. And you say Alaska is damn big, empty place bordered by nowhere, beyond frigid temperatures and snowfalls ass deep to a giraffe. It has the weapons to kill anything more complex than a rock. Civilization exists in tiny, disenfranchised pockets surrounded by a howling void. Basically, it's a universe in a microcosm. How much do you think that is a part of the secret sauce that makes Laird Barron, right? Um, that tiny slice of the cosmos that is this kind of unexplainable place to people who haven't been there.
I don't know. First of all, if I would have written it in time, I wrote it about the time that Swift to Chase came out, back in 2016, and I think I wanted to include it. It was just that it wasn't free of the exclusivity. You know, I had sold it to SG Joshi for an anthology, and I didn't get the rights back in time or something. You know, no fault to anybody. It just the timing wasn't right. Because I would have loved to have had it in that collection. But since there were other Alaska stories in this one, I think that it worked out. You know, I don't know if it's the secret sauce. It certainly demonstrates my very fraught relationship with my native state. And I think it probably is a pretty good demonstration of how I think about landscape as a character. Um, you know, even when I'm not directly writing about a character, I find that, you know, a human character or even an inhuman character, I find that a lot of times I'll lean on geography and how I feel about a place, my experiences with it will rise to the surface. I really do like talking about landscapes and geography.
Yeah. And you
And
write
that is
very,
kind of the spine. I would say that's definitely a spine of my, you know, or an axis of my writing throughout my entire, whether it's poetry or science fiction or horror, it doesn't matter, or the noir. I do feel like geography is it might be the linchpin of everything I do.
right. Yeah. And it comes out, and, you know, you write fantastically about landscape. And it's funny because, I had a friend uh, who I don't know how to say this. This is going to sound really terrible, and I don't want to really get into it. But Alaska basically destroyed her, right? Uh, her daughter was killed up there, and then she had this situation where she was trying to figure out the truth of what happened to her daughter, and it basically it and so my mentality when I think of Alaska, I have a very nasty headspace where whatever, because I've never been there, right? And so my experience with it, and so it's interesting for me because I have an ick factor when I ever just think about Alaska, and so it's been very interesting for me to read your Alaska stories because I kind of come into it with a natural ick factor in the background. Does that make sense? And so it's really interesting to me to read about when you say you have that kind of back and forth relationship with it. That comes across for me, but it's interesting for the moments when you're talking about the things that sound beautiful about it. um I have a really interesting, I feel it in a really interesting way. I don't know how else to say that, but
I'm glad that I'm able to convey it. It's pretty much how I feel about it. I'll never go back willingly. You know, and
right.
I've written about a lot of other landscapes. I've written about Washington rainforests. I've written about the high desert in Oregon and Washington. You know,
Yeah.
I don't have the same. I think the menace because I write dark fiction. There's always an air of menace, but it's the Alaska stuff hits far different. You know, it's a different feeling, a different
Yeah.
vibe that comes off the work. When I write a lot, when I go back over those Alaska stories, I shudder just a little bit.
Yeah,
And
I explained to my wife one time that you write about Alaska. In my opinion, it feels like a fantastical land in many ways, and it feels like hyper real in a very cool way. Um,
yeah,
in the way that you write about, not in a way where you're like, I want to go to there,
no.
but you know, um,
And I like I was telling Jessica, you know, I've restrained myself about things I could write about Alaska.
it's
So
interesting.
we'll just leave it at that.
Let's just leave it at that. Yeah. Nemesis, can you tell me a little bit about that story?
Nemesis is one of the more experimental stories. I wrote that for I think it ended up being just a one issue magazine, but I was approached by, you know, I don't want to do him just, you know, disservice, but like an amateur editor, publisher, you know, for trying to put something together. And I don't think they've done anything since then. And they just wanted something, you know, out there. And so that's what that is. And I like to play with time, with time and perspective. I've done that almost every collection. There's one or two stories that deal with the paradox of time or the parallax of time, how maybe it's fixed, but depending on where we are in relation to some kind of event, everything's different. And that's kind of what that is. That's it's related to a story I wrote. Stylistically, it's related to a story that I wrote. My very first published story, Shiva, Open Your Eye, and then I did one called Vastation, which was basically if I had written Shiva, Open Your Eye 10 years on into my career, and then this one is a few years after that, 6 or 7 years later. They're all different. They all have their own uh, obsessions, but they all deal with multiple realities, with omniscience, with and with time.
Yeah. Well, and so next is a story that I want to talk about, which is one of my favorites in the collection. And um, I personally, one of the things I like about Stephen Graham Jones, for example, is that he has zero fucks to give about talking about his influences and talking about the writers that he loves. And you don't either. And you've done this before. And when I read this story, I said, "Oh, I love this because I know this guy has read Samak and Jack Vance,
That's right.
and Soul of Me is so Jack Vance in a awesome way." Um, but when I say it's Samak and Vance, is that the whole Rex as a character feels like a Samak character, and the setup and the setting feels like a Jack Vance universe, in my opinion. And I say that all as an absolute 100% compliment. I think you nailed that shit. Soul of Me, I loved every second of it, and I was so glad to find out that there's more Rex stories. So, you want to tell folks a little bit about Soul of Me?
Yeah, well, thank you. I grew up reading those authors you mentioned. You know, I mean, that was I wasn't consciously thinking about Samak when I wrote that, but that's a great compliment. I mean, these guys are all you might as well embrace your influences. They're all there. They're whether you
Right.
acknowledge it or not, they're there. And by acknowledge, I mean to yourself even. They're in there working. We were talking about Philip K. Dick earlier, and I think Philip K. Dick is I need to think more consciously about him because I'm sure that he's back in there Laird, do this. It'd be better if you did that. But yeah, that's one of multiple stories I've written about Rex. He's kind of like an eternal champion. He dies a lot in my stories. And because basically he's an archetype. And in this particular incarnation of Rex, it's millions of years in one possible future, and he is the only surviving canine. He's a canine cyborg war dog, and we're not talking about uh, low level like he bites harder than another dog. No, he's has quantum. Basically he can become more dense. His mass can grow exponentially. He has laser beam eyes, mason breath, that whole thing. He can launch nuclear missiles. So he's a doomsday machine, and he is trying to protect a tribe of hominids that he's discovered. Basically, Earth is recycling itself, and he's taken up the mantle of that he had before he was buried after the last war, 2 million years ago. He's taken up the mantle of proto-humans protector, or
And I
has he?
will tell
Or
you why.
has he?
And I will tell you why I said Samak. Well, there's the obvious with a dog being the main character, and he wrote City, of course. But more, it's the pastoral future thing that
Yeah,
he did all the time. That he would foresee into the future, and like it wasn't about megalopolises and like because he was a Midwestern newspaper man who and one thing I recently learned about Samak was is that when he went to school, there was no roads in his Wisconsin county, and he rode a horse to school, and there were no roads. And if you think about him writing science fiction that he did with
yeah.
that background, it says a
Explain
lot.
it. Wait, he overcame his imagination knew no bounds, but also it was tailored to his environment. I mean, we are a product of our environment.
Yeah, I just recently finished a Samak novel for the first time called "Why Call Them Back from Heaven." I don't know if you've heard about it, but
Mm-mm.
It's great. It's about this company that's on the edge of inventing immortality, or the ability to keep people immortal, and how there's like this race, capitalist race, to have yourself die and frozen with enough capital that you can be revived and live forever. Um, and man, it's really good. Highly recommended to everyone. It's called "Why Call Them Back from Heaven." Clifford Samack, and he wrote that one in the '60s. And it's just amazing to look at this guy who had been writing science fiction for 50 years at that point, and kind of seeing how he's reacting to the new wave. Right,
Right, right.
very cool. But yeah, I see the Samac in there. I see definitely the Jack fans. Rex feels like a character that could be in the Dying Earth, um, in many ways. Um, and maybe I'm seeing that wrong, but of the Alan Smithy stories, and it's funny to call them that. Swift to Chase obviously was collected before; was the name of a collection. Um, these ones have this kind of like global feel. They feel like they could be movies, and they feel like
Yeah.
yeah, and
Those are my Jessica Mace. That's the Jessica Mace section, essentially.
yeah, she's in more than one of the stories, but not all of them. Correct? If I'm
She's in all four stories,
oh,
but
she is okay.
in a couple stories she's merely mentioned. You know, she's like
Right.
a bit part. She has a bit part in Fear Sun, and she has a bit like she's mentioned in or brief cameos in Now Don't Make Me Assume My Ultimate Form.
Yeah.
But then she's the main character in Swift to Chase, which had never been collected before. That was actually a
Oh, really? It
uh
was just the title.
yeah, people were very confused by that, and I said, "Good, see Gene Wolfe, the Island of Doctor Death, Doctor Death's Island,
Yeah.
etc." There's like five different variations on that. Um,
True.
right. So the Isle of
Well,
the Death
that
Doctor,
that's
whatever he did.
funny because was it anthologized?
Yes,
Okay.
it was in a I want to say Darren Spiegel. I apologize if there was somebody else. It was an anthology years ago. It was I want to say it was called Climbing Adam's Ladder. It was about evolution horror.
Okay. I
And so I
felt
thought,
like
oh, I'm gonna I'm gonna do the dangerous game, the most dangerous game, which is, everybody has to do that at some point, I think, during their writing career. If you're a thriller, mystery, noir writer, I think you have to do your version of the most dangerous game. And so it was that, but there's, obviously a super villain or superhero aspect to it as well.
right. And great title, American remake or a Japanese ghost story.
American remake of a Japanese ghost story,
Of
right?
a Japanese ghost story. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's I wrote that one for you know what? It's escaping me, but it was recorded by Pseudopod. They did a recording of it. Oh, it was there is no death, there are no dead. It was an anthology uh back in like 2019 or 2018, something like that. So, somewhere around there.
Well, and the last section has a lot of very memorable pieces: Strident Collar, Not a Speck of Light, Tiptoe. And I know, for example, I know like Neil McRobert went crazy for Tiptoe. I am a Not a Speck of Light guy. That story, that the Soul of Me is the one that most excited me for like all the different vibes and things you brought in. But as far as just an affecting story, Not a Speck of Light is the one that kind of hit me hard. You want to talk about I mean, it's a great title, so that's why it's probably the title of the collection. But can you tell us a little bit about that story?
You bet. I First of all, I'm really glad you like it. Uh, so I've written a handful of stories in the last 18 months, and the thing is, they're not collected. They're they're winging their way through cyberspace, or they're in magazines or whatever. So you'll start seeing more and more of those as time goes by. This one, though, was one of the very first things I wrote after I got out of the hospital, or at least I was working on it and finally finished it in time to get it in this. Um, you
And it's
know,
a dog story.
it's a dog story. There's several dog stories in here, right? But at
Yeah.
least two big ones. And so you know, I probably won't write too many stories like more stories like this because I'm shifting into dark fantasy. Although this does have there is a dark fantasy element if you read far enough. But the reason I named it and the collection not a speck of light is because I felt like that was sort of the overall, it kind of was indicative of the darkness of the collection, but not necessarily in a horror, there's a monster coming to get you, but more just in a metaphysical, or a philosophical sense. And this story is essentially, if you were just to encapsulate it, just a high concept, a couple goes to hell to rescue their dog.
Right. And so the moment where this story like kind of was just like, oh hell yeah, I get where this came from, or this idea is this idea that these fucking weirdos like offer them money and say like we'll give you such and such money to for your dog. It's like it puts such a perfect point on we love our dogs so much, like you couldn't give me enough money, right, to part. They're my family, they're my loved one. And that moment in the story of just like, oh well, this then becomes the danger because these creepy people like want their dog, you know. And the whole thing, like that moment of just like the offer, the indecent proposal kind of thing of it, it
Very
makes you
good.
think about your dog, your loved one, right?
Yeah.
And to me, most powerful part of that story, just very affecting. And yeah,
It's
just
also a sequel to the other story. All the stories in that section, I shouldn't say all of them, but there's several stories in the second half of the book that are in that location. There's a story called Strident Caller, which is an actual direct prequel or yeah, prequel to that story. And then one of the Jessica May stories, American Remake, takes place in one of the houses that's mentioned there. So like there are three stories that take place in that neighborhood in the collection.
yeah,
So that's another thing I did with the collection. I didn't want it to be thematically synchronized like Swift to Chase, not to that level. But I did like the idea that there was like a through line through some of the stories. Like you could go, oh, this is the same character from the last story, but they're in a different situation, or this is the same location. What's going on there now?
right.
And that will echo. Actually, some of the stuff that happened in those stories will echo into future contemporary stories that I write.
Well, that
I'm not.
happened with Phil too when they're like, we can build you. People always talk about it being in the same universe as Blade Runner, but it's only because he thought he couldn't sell it and gave up on it and recycled elements from it, and they really weren't meant to live together like in Do Androids Dream and We Can Build You, right? It just happened, but then he liked the idea that there, you know, he liked the idea that two stories had the same characters, and then the readers were wondering if it was the same universe or not, and he didn't care, right? he was he was like, whatever, you know.
Yeah, and I right, for me, that's I kind of feel similarly. If you catch on to it, or if that's what you read into it, wonderful. If you don't, you should be able to enjoy the story. 'Cause that's always the trick I feel when I'm writing is I don't want you to feel like you had to read the other ones to get anything out of it. But if you do read them, you're like, oh, this is going on. And one thing I'll say about Not a Speck of Light, I mean, it probably for me is probably the most important story in the collection, just because it's hard to write. I mean, it's a 10,000 word story, so it's not short. It's hard, that kind of represents me getting my strength back as a writer, technique wise. Like I'm able to focus and I'm able to create. I still can do what I want to do. But it also is important because I feel you want to talk about the secret sauce. Well, it's not so much that, but it makes a point about my writing in general, and that is it's the gesture. I feel it's kind of a response to the Ligottiites. Life is meaningless, and then you got the heavily religious people who are like, oh no, if you do good deeds, you're going to heaven. the road I took with that one, I think I take it with a lot of my stuff. It doesn't matter whether it's useless. It doesn't matter whether it will save you if there's salvation. It just matters that you did it. And that story right there essentializes that. There is no salvation, but was the gesture that they made worth it nonetheless? In other words, if you what you do on earth, if there's no heaven and there's no hell and there's no afterlife, or there's just a purgatorial afterlife, and it doesn't matter what you do, does it matter what you do? And I argue that yes, it does, because the act in and of itself, whether it's good or evil, has a weight. It had a weight in that moment. It mattered in that moment. And that's kind of what I was getting at with that story, among other things.
Right. Well, Laird, this collection is incredible. Not a speck of light. I'm losing light here on the West Coast. Um, and I'm just so excited that you're back, and I didn't know that that was the only story or the first story you wrote when you came back, so that makes it more meaningful, of course. um I couldn't help but talk about in my review, which I've already written but I haven't posted for this book, that there's no way to talk about this book without like celebrating what it means for us to have you here and still working and still writing. And um, I really am most looking forward to the hinted fantasy collection that you're working on. But I'm just so excited that we have this, because I consider you and Brian Evanson, Lisa Morton, some of the best like short story wordsmiths that we've got going right now. The writers that just for my money, the people that are just writing some of the best short stories. And this collection is very indicative of
Well, that means a lot to me, and it's it's stuff like that that's kind of helped me get through this really rough patch the last couple of years. So thank you so much.
yeah. And we'll I'm been keeping you in mind for some of the future. We've been doing a series on here on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame stories, and I definitely want to have you back on to do some of that and some of the more panels. I'm trying to do more panels lately because I feel like it's like bringing that feeling from the conventions of when we had the panels on. And I've been giving you your space for good reason, but I want the people to hear your voice again more, because you are one of the best, and I love your take on things. And by the way, one thing that happened recently on Dickheads was I was able to show you talking about Barry Malzberg's stories to Barry when we
Oh,
interviewed.
really? Oh,
Yes,
cool.
yes. As we were uh, I showed him the clip of you talking about it before we started.
Transference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
transfer. Yeah, and he was very excited and said, "Well, geez, I'm gonna have to read that guy." And he's yeah, still
That's
amazing.
one of the greatest horror stories I've ever read. So,
Yeah, yeah, he's and it's cool to see him still well. And my co-host at Dickheads, D Harlan Wilson, is republishing a lot of his work. And
oh, great.
yeah, and has already reissued Galaxies, Beyond Apollo, Revelations, and he's got more coming down the pipe. We're keeping Barry alive, as he said, in more
You
ways
know
than.
what? That I highly respect that. Between that and the C. Elmore, plaque. I just it's what kept Joshi, for all my differences with Joshi is to be commended for him and Derleth keeping Lovecraft and cosmic horror in general going. You
Yeah,
know, there I know that, I and others have worked really hard to try to get Michael Shea in front of more people. Patton Oswalt of all people is a huge booster of Michael Shea. Um, and so I think that kind of stuff is is super important because it's just unfair that
Yeah.
writers who are so important, artists who are so important, you know, fall by the wayside. And I think it's great when future generations, you
Yeah.
know, can
Well,
do their
that's
part to elevate them a little bit.
Well, and that's the point of my column at Amazing Stories, the 25th Century Five and Dime, is I don't write about the modern stuff ever, even though I read it and I write a lot of reviews of the modern stuff for my blog. But for Amazing Stories, I just want to, you know, keep the old stuff alive. And CL Moore to me, and it's not just because I'm a Hoosier and she's from Indiana. I, uh, I think Shambleau is one of the greatest horror stories ever written, and uh,
Yeah.
for that
Uh,
alone, she, well, or Vintage Season, which I know it's credited to both her and her husband, but the word is she wrote 90% of that one, and I think that,
I keep hearing those rumors about things, yeah, that they did
yeah.
together.
Well, and with the, sometimes they would just publish under the names, and some stories, supposedly what you need is like entirely Kuttner, and Vintage Season is entirely CL Moore, and who knows?
Right. Right.
We,
Well,
we,
hey,
well,
before we wrap up, I would be remiss. I would like to take a second and just say, first of all, thank you, but uh, I want to thank Doug Morano at Bad Hand Books. That's that
yeah,
he's doing great work there. It's a family affair, but he's doing a lot of it on his own. And I really appreciate that you know, he's one of those editors I was talking about that, is very faithful and that we're in the same frequency. And I've been very fortunate to work with him. I was at that reading the other day and there were a lot of people there and they were asking, what's it like working with Doug? And I just want to say publicly, it's just wonderful. It's one of the best experiences I've had in publishing in 25 years.
yeah. Well, he's doing this book looks great. I mean, the art, everything looks fantastic, and
Yeah, he's a good man, a joy to work with, and the the great character, but also just from a technical perspective, everything is just so with the books, and I feel very fortunate that I have him in my corner.
well, and on that note, people can find the past episodes where Laird's been on here before too. The two-part best horror short stories episode with Mary San Giovanni and Judge Mark Rothenberg, who folks will know from who does my top 10 reads of the year episode every January with me. Judge Rothenberg wanted me to say hello to you too, Laird.
Oh,
And
right back at him. I enjoy talking with him.
yeah, and uh, we're he when this was announced, in fact, he was the person that wrote me and said, you pre-ordered, right? And I was like, yeah, we're getting on it. We're getting on it. So on that note, everybody, please buy Laird's stuff and look for him in the future and on other podcasts. We are so glad to have his voice back in the community. It's so important. Thank you, Laird. And we will see you next time. Thank you, everybody. I'm so bad at ending these. That's the hardest part for me is stopping. So we're going to stop now. See you folks later. Bye.